Well, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Emma Albee, and I'm the Science Information Specialist at Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. And welcome to the Acadia National Park Science Symposium, Session 4 on Adapting to a Changing Climate. Thank you for joining us. Just a few housekeeping notes at the beginning. This session is being recorded, just so you know, and it will be posted to the Schoodic Institute's website next week sometime. And if you have any trouble with your internet, you may want to turn off your cameras if things are freezing up. So now I'll just introduce Abe Miller-Rushing, who's the science coordinator at Acadia National Park, for a welcome.
Hey everyone, on behalf of the National Park Service, I want to thank you very much for attending today. I think I actually lost count. Fourth or fifth installment of this year's kind of virtual series of the Acadia National Park Science Symposium. Session 4, here we go. I should have just looked at the slide, session 4. And so I want to thank you all for coming. I want to kind of reiterate, I can't say this enough, that the science in the park that happens and the science communication, by and large, happens because of you. We have a great staff here that does a lot of science on our own, but the vast majority of the science that goes on here is done by partners, which we really strongly appreciate. And this is a part of our effort to really keep communications going with you and keep our science community vibrant. Today's session really addresses one of the most pressing challenges facing the National Park Service and conservation more broadly. Given that climate change and that conditions are changing and we cannot keep things as they were in the past, how do we make decisions about and how do we take actions to choose where we want our forests and our lakes and our oceans to be going forward in time, and that's not something that any of us were really trained for, to make decisions about how we manage for change, but that's something that we're facing right now. And so today's speaker lineup will really talk about that, and I think, and hopefully really create a lot of discussion that we'll have during our breakout groups and during the open discussion section at the end of the session, and then ongoing discussion as we can all continue our work together. But with that, I'm gonna just hand it over to Nick Fisichelli for the first talk, and he's gonna be talking about guiding the future forest of Acadia and kind of set the tone for the whole session, I think. Over to you, Nick.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Abe. And thank you, Emma, as well. I'm going to stop my video to try to preserve as much bandwidth as I can here. I'm in the office today at Schoodic. So welcome everybody. Normally I get to do the welcome, but I am a speaker today in this session, session 4, Adapting to a Changing Climate. Again, Nick Fisichelli, President and CEO of Schoodic Institute. So we talk about forests and more at sort of a higher level, this broader framework on adapting to a changing climate. The future will be wicked rad. This was my poor attempt at a witty title to my talk here. But to think about the future, we first have to really think about the past and understand past change. Here's a photo from 100 years ago. And this shows Horace Albright, one of the founding fathers of the National Park Service, here at a picnic table in Yellowstone National Park. Crazy photo, right? I know what you're thinking. That's a picnic table? Wow, look at that. Look at those spindly legs. Probably couldn't support 2 full-grown bears. Obviously, there's lots of changes that have happened in the last 100 years. Feeding bears being one of them, picnic tables being another. Who knows what picnic tables will look like in the future, but we know they're going to probably look different than they did in the past, and lots more than just picnic tables. We could and should spend hours talking about all the change already happening and projected to happen here in and around Acadia: hotter temperatures, floods, drought, pests, record visitation, habitat fragmentation, and human alterations to the land and waterscape, loss of native plants, increase in invasive species, etc. And the other speakers in this session today will give more details into these changes and the actions being taken and considered around some of these challenges. And so you'll hear from Jesse and Lydia and Brian on some of these specifics. I'm going to start and going to mostly stick to this higher level framework for this kind of critical work, and then I will give a couple of quick examples at the end. Climate change adaptation and really adapting to any changes includes a spectrum of approaches, from resisting to accepting to directing change. That's the RAD framework, the RAD, resist, accept, direct. I've been working on this with colleagues at the National Park Service and other partners for many years now. We first published a version of this spectrum in a 2016 paper that was looking at the concept of resilience and whether that was really valuable and useful in adaptation, or whether it was actually sort of a maladaptive term that was slowing down our ability to adapt to changing conditions. And then what you're seeing here in this slide, this is a new report that we published, just came out in December of 2020. So it's an NPS natural resource report led by my esteemed colleague, Gregor Skierman, and other folks with the National Park Service and partner organizations, and putting forth this framework for the 21st century natural resource manager. And so I just want to run through this framework for the RAD framework, the resist, accept, direct, and I'll show it here as a flow diagram or a dichotomous key if you're a plant nerd like I am. I like to think of it more that way. And so just a couple of questions to run through here in this decision tree. Are you shaping the trajectory of climate change? Yes or no? If the answer to this is yes, is no, this is the accepting change strategy that's being used. If the answer to are you shaping the trajectory of change, if the answer is yes to that, then the next question that arises, are you managing for historical conditions or for a new desired condition? And here there are of course the two answers to this. Whether if you're managing for historical conditions, that's resisting change. If you're managing for new conditions, this is the directing change. And so this is how you end up, just through these couple of questions, how you navigate the resist, accept, direct framework. And the right pathway here, really, it's up to you. What are the goals? What is desirable? What must be avoided? And again, it's about moving beyond the blueprint of the past to determine desired conditions of the future. And this is hard, as Abe said in the intro. We weren't necessarily trained for this. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. Sometimes the path forward isn't clear, and this is where science and experiments really come into the picture. And I think that this is what's really exciting about working in Acadia. And I think this is one of the places at the forefront of this type of work. And it's the park and partners working on this that are making this happen. So Abe and Rebecca Cole-Will, Kevin Schneider, Jesse Wheeler, who you'll hear from today, and the whole crew at Acadia, and then other partners, including FOA and Maine and others, are really pushing forward, looking forward, and being proactive in this work, and doing so cooperatively. You know, a key piece is that this is new. There's a lot that we don't know, and that we need those partnerships and that scientific framework to advance this work, and ultimately to protect our natural and cultural heritage in places like Acadia National Park. So the couple of examples I'll mention here. This one is really focused on that future forest of Acadia, and this is the tree test bed experiment. Here's Hayes Henderson, one of our technicians, last summer working on this project. And we know 9 out of the 10 most abundant tree species in Acadia are projected to lose habitat, significant suitable habitat, in the coming decades. And so many questions surround, you know, which species and under what conditions are they actually going to lose habitat? You know, that is, how sensitive are these species to current and emerging conditions, and what restoration techniques will be successful in the future. And so this is just an example project, really using that RAD framework, where we planted 16 species as bare root saplings and 12 species from seed. Half of the species are ones found in Acadia today, and half are projected to have suitable habitat in the future. We replicated this at 4 sites across the climate gradient that is Acadia National Park. So from coastal to a little bit inland, and from low to high elevation. And again, really to assess the resist and direct options, which tree species are doing well under emerging conditions. And then again, using that information to inform future steps. And then the second example is from the Cadillac Summit Restoration Project. The Cadillac Summit has suffered from 150 years of heavy human use. So now the question is, how do we restore? What do we restore? And there are several people and organizations working on this and related projects. So Jill Weber and the Native Plant Trust are working on the restoration. Caitlin McDonough McKenzie, Chris Meadow, other researchers are working on this as well, to understand how adaptive are species to the changing conditions, and really what management actions are needed to attain or retain desired conditions. So again, really using this RAD framework in developing the science in these projects. And in these cases, managers and partner scientists are assessing what is possible and informing the answers to the questions here in the RAD framework. The scientific approach is really critical here for testing, for monitoring, and for adapting. So last slide here, and you knew I was going to come back to picnic tables. Now, what's the new picnic table that you're managing towards, or other resource here in Acadia or elsewhere? And with that, I will hand it back over to Abe.
We have time for one question, if anyone has a question in between speakers.
Yeah, this is Steve Smith from Cape Cod National Seashore. Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
That's an interesting experiment. I'm just wondering, wouldn't soil conditions of your garden experiment have a lot to do with whether these vulnerable seedlings survive, or is that, in your opinion, not that much of a factor? And I guess you try to replicate typical conditions that they would encounter if they were being recruited to a forest or something?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this experiment, we use the same soil at all 4 sites, so keeping that uniform, and then looking at differences in climate. Some other research projects I didn't mention here, we've actually used both the native soil at sites and used a uniform soil across sites to try to tease apart the influence of soils from other factors.
Right. And how long do you envision this experiment lasts? Presumably multi-year, where you're going to track sort of how these things do?
Yeah, that was a 3-year experiment. So looking just at those
Okay.
early years of establishment, growth, and survival in
Gotcha.
in the tree test bed one I showed. Some other ones that we're doing actually outside the park are
Right.
longer term that we hope will last, multi-year to multi-decade.
Right. And is that stuff written up? Like, can we access that?
It's in process.
Okay. Sounds really neat. That's so thanks.
Thank you very much, Nick. And now we're going to hear from Jesse Wheeler.
Thanks, Emma. Let's see. So welcome everybody. So I'm Jesse Wheeler. I'm the Vegetation Program Manager at Acadia National Park. And since it is National Invasive Species Awareness Week, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about perhaps the future of invasives here at Acadia, and more specifically non-native invasive insect pests and non-native plants, and kind of what we're doing now, but also sort of challenges we're likely facing into the future as the conditions that were described by Abe and Nick. So I think first off, we're in a pretty decent position at Acadia where largely our forests and wetlands are pretty healthy. There's some of the healthiest in the eastern United States. This is largely because we have so few invasive species really present across the landscape in a relative manner. Also, we have a nice mosaic of habitats. This may be a mixture of young and older forests that kind of contribute to some of that overall larger health on the landscape and diversity. As managers, our goal is to try to maintain these intact native systems, which can be certainly challenging in kind of normal times and historical times. But if we want to support slow change, which is happening all the time, right? And that's something that is a process that we want to support and influence. However, with the warming climate and the conditions that provide, it's really going to be difficult for some of this adaptation for certain species or a community of species, right, to move forward in that sort of healthy way. And I also see this other stressor on the landscape with invasive species compounding that to where if we have a warming climate with higher temperatures and changing moisture regimes that change from historical patterns, they'll combine for kind of quite a challenge. Insects and plant pests are certainly on the move, and so this is something that we've been dealing with for a little while. But I'm really seeing in the coming decades, kind of maybe even a tenfold challenge with this, especially on the coast here with warming winter minimum temperatures. That allows for pests to survive, particularly insects, through the winter, and then they can replicate and spread on their own. We're also seeing longer growing seasons, so that largely benefits non-native plants and invasive plants and how they compete with our native plants. And also people continue to move pests around the landscape. Sometimes this is intentional if we're moving plant material or soils from one place to another and planting intentionally, but oftentimes it's unintentional. Could be moving firewood, right, for use and not knowing you're picking up a hitchhiker. So I'll give you a few examples of some of the insect pests that we're looking at and concerned about, and then also look at one with a little bit more detail, sort of a little bit of a case study. So southern pine beetle is one that I'm kind of describing as in the neighborhood. It's actually a native insect pest to the southeast primarily of the US, but it's expanded its range further north into southern New England. And so this is one where it attacks hard pine. So for here at Acadia, that would be our pitch pine and jack pine communities, not so much our red pine communities anymore. And so this is one we're looking at, because when it gets to outbreak levels, it can certainly devastate an area. Emerald ash borer is one that I'm describing as kind of at our mailbox or end of the driveway. It was detected in Maine in 2018, so just a couple years ago. It's not here yet that we've observed at Acadia, but we do monitor for it on an annual basis, and this one attacks our native ash trees. Hemlock woolly adelgid is another one that is, I describe as on our doorstep because it's one that has been expanding along coastal Maine in eastern hemlock forests. And it was just last spring confirmed in a forest setting on hemlock just outside of the park on Mount Desert Island. And then we have red pine scale, which I'll go into a little bit more detail because this is one that we have on the landscape already. And so this is a non-native scale insect pest that affects our native red pines. And when it was confirmed in 2014, it had already started killing red pines, and red pines were declining. So in response to that, we tried to set up some monitoring plots as well as get an inventory of where red pines were on the landscape. And I should mention that this detection was on Mount Desert Island. It was the first one in Maine, so it was not on our radar, so to speak. And so when it came in, we were like, what's going on? How is it affecting red pine? What's the spread like? And so unfortunately, when we set up the monitoring plots, even healthy red pines that we saw and we took samples of had the scale insect present. And so it really had already spread across at least the island landscape here in MDI to where we really couldn't do much about trying to suppress the insect or slow its spread very much. And so what this kind of looks like on the landscape, or I should say looked like, the images here on the left are of Norumbega Mountain taken from Somme Sound. In 2014, it's a little hard to tell, but amongst the evergreens there, there's little reddish gray bands of the dying red pine canopy needles. In 2019, 5 years later, all those are pretty much dead and kind of ghost snag trees. In reality, red pine scale alone could kill a red pine tree in 2 or 3 years. And so what does this mean like for a future forest, right? What Nick is talking about for what's it going to be like with warming conditions, what can grow here? And so what I'm talking about is this: when we have these disturbances like insect outbreaks, what are we going to have? And so preliminarily, with the information we found from the monitoring plots, eastern white pine, our native white pines, a mix of spruce and hardwoods, are there on the understory already. And so that's, probably something that's going to be of the regeneration that's going to come up. But the other question is too, what might take the place when there's this increased light? Might it be invasive plants or other tree species that aren't necessarily native to here, right? And so here's where it's the combination of the invasive insects and invasive plants that I find kind of troubling. And it makes it really difficult to allow for adaptation of these forests and wetlands on the kind of a natural cycle. Like I said, when you have a disturbance of a canopy opening, increased light on the understory, especially if there's invasive plants already present, they will likely outcompete the natives. They'll take advantage of that. They do well with increased light and soil disturbance, and they'll kind of take over that space. And what that will do is kind of halt succession. Whether it's a native or non-native tree seedling there, it'll likely suppress it. And so you get this total disruption of regeneration of forests. And so that's one big reason why we prioritize our efforts for invasive plant management and suppressing invasives in forests and wetlands here at Acadia. So I'll give you just a couple of examples of some of these invasive plants that are troubling right now, but also see into the future. One is glossy buckthorn, an invasive wetland shrub. And from the map here, you can kind of see the last handful of years, the areas where we've been removing glossy buckthorn from wetlands and forests. It has invaded and more acres of forests and wetlands on particularly MDI, but certainly in Acadia than any other plant that we manage. And so its spread is quite robust in many different habitat types, including a recent one like on Cadillac Mountain here, where we recently found an infestation in a gray birch kind of woodland area that on the North Ridge Trail we found and have started to remove it from there. And it was a little bit troubling again, because it's kind of like, well, this is a wetland shrub. What is it doing on a mountain ridge top? And then the other one here is Japanese barberry and common barberries, which are more of an upland terrestrial invasive plant shrub species that, looking at the map here, you can kind of see, again, over the same period of time, is all over the place that we're managing, including Idaho and Schoodic Peninsula, in addition to the MDI section of the park. And then a recent troubling place where we found it was on the Cedar Swamp Mountain, an area near Amphitheater Carriage Road loop, where several acres of a relatively intact, healthy hardwood forest of the park exists on this slope. And we found Japanese barberry kind of all over the place on the understory. And my question is why? It certainly, we find it in one shrub or two shrub all the time. It may move via wildlife dispersal of water, but in this case, there's a lot underneath a healthy forest with not much evidence of recent disturbance. So that's where when we do have a disturbance, it's going to be trouble in areas like this. So you may be wondering, well, what's this deal about disturbance? This is natural, right? And absolutely, it's part of a healthy landscape, healthy ecosystem is to have disturbance, increased diversity, right? But what I'm talking about is kind of like larger scale and very frequent disturbances with pest outbreaks. When I think of disturbance, I think of the forest fire 47 around here. Many people do. That was large in scale, and those are infrequent events typically. But even with fire, you can have a healthy outcome of a forest, like in the imagery in the middle of shortly after the fire around Cerdamont, and now we have a pretty healthy aspen forest, albeit some invasive plants that we still have to manage in that area. And then you have beaver floods and dams and windstorms and canopy gaps as well that happen on a smaller scale of disturbance that we also have to deal with. And then there are also native insect pests as well, like spruce budworm, that come through infrequently. So I just want to conclude by saying that I feel like, again, we're at a pretty good position here at Acadia in terms of tackling some of these problems, because we have pretty healthy systems already and we have a bit of a capacity to respond. And so it's worth the effort. But I just want to recognize that it's going to be an extra challenge for us in the future to allow for adaptation of our forests and wetlands that maintain that character of Acadia. So I'll turn it back to Abe, I think.
We have time for a question if anyone has a question. Yeah, Steve.
Hi, Jesse. Nice presentation. What are you using how are you managing those exotics exactly? Are you employing the Northeast Exotic Plant Management Team, or doing it yourselves, or contracting, or and is it mostly herbicide, which is mostly what we do too? And have you encountered any blowback from adjacent communities about herbiciding in the park?
Yeah, that's a good question, Steve. So we largely are doing it ourselves. We have our own crew, our own sort of Acadia-based invasive plant management team. But and we do use herbicide and mechanical methods. We follow the integrated pest management approach. But we largely do it in-house with support from partners and as well. And so far, we have a pretty good reception about invasive plant management in general around the community. As you know, especially at Acadia, but other parks in the East, we're integrated right with our communities right next door. And so that is a big thing. So largely it's pretty decent, but yeah, it could be controversial too.
Alan, did you have a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was wondering about invasives plants that were brought in by humans, because Acadia's got a whole lot of people that live around the edge of the park with beautiful gardens. So maybe they had things they didn't want that spread to the park, like dandelions, and other things that they did plant that spread either by birds or wind, things like bittersweet, Japanese knotweed, and burning bush. So is this a major source of invasives, or are they coming in by just natural means?
It's a great question. Yeah, I didn't really give a lot of introduction to what the invasive plants are on our landscape now and how they got here. But the ones that I highlighted with glossy buckthorn, Japanese barberry, those are ornamental plants that were brought here on purpose, mostly used in gardens. And so, yes, there's been a lot of escapees, and I alluded to some of that, but that's partly with the fire 47, with that disturbance happening in and around Bar Harbor. That has certainly contributed to some amount of that, kind of garden escapee, and then growth of natural areas.
And is there any thought of using volunteers from Friends of Acadia instead of just cleaning out ditches in the fall, that maybe they could be assigned certain sections of the park and, have a steward that takes care of Day Mountain or something like that with very specific plants that they're authorized to remove?
That's something we've tried a little bit in the past, but alluding to what Steve was asking about, who does this work, we found it's a lot more effective and productive when we have personnel that are specializing in a lot of this removal, especially if it's with using herbicides and stuff. But that's not to say that we haven't in the past and can in the future use volunteers to work on this effort as well.
And do you replace the plants that are removed with native species?
That's another good question. It might be a topic for another person on this next, actually. But also that is something we're looking into. Yes, is revegetation native plants.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Jesse. And we're going to move on to Brian Henkel next.
All right, so is my screen showing up?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for the opportunity. I'm Brian Henkel. I'm the Wild Acadia Project Coordinator. I work for Friends of Acadia, and I work directly with the park on resource management issues. And I want to talk to you about the Wild Acadia Next, a more forward-looking approach to resource management. The Wild Acadia initiative began with the core values of ecological integrity, resilience, cultural authenticity, and a desire to change the approach of resource management. And the intent was to take a more collaborative approach across disciplines and divisions, and to work more directly with partners and stakeholders. The early work began with an assessment of conditions within the Cromwell Brook watershed, focusing on degraded conditions and the stressors that led to that degradation, and then develop a suite of projects to kind of reduce or remove stressors and try and improve those conditions. Through that work, we began to recognize the need to not simply look to restore some past condition, but to determine what our desired future conditions are and how do we guide the resources toward those conditions. The climate at Acadia has changed. We have lengthened growing season, warmer winters, intensified precipitation, and increased visitation. And those changes are likely to continue further. So management actions taken today will have the greatest chance for long-term success if the future conditions are considered within our decision-making process today. So restoration may be a useful word still to describe kind of the work that we're doing through Wild Acadia, but not really in the sense of restoring to a past condition. Restoration, maybe if it's still a usable word, of ecological communities' capacity to thrive in today's and tomorrow's climate is a better way to think about it, such that they're resilient into the future. Really, we're looking more toward managing within the climate framework that we have now due to the changes that have occurred and managing for the changes we anticipate are still to come. So climate change has direct impacts on infrastructure, cultural resources, and the occurrence and distribution of plant and animal species. Precipitation has increased by 6 inches over the past 100 years. The timing of that rain has shifted. It's out of the summer months and sometimes creating drought conditions during the summer, and it's into more frequent high intensity fall rainstorms. Our winter storms are more often rain instead of snow, and it decreases the snowpack. And so this changes stream flow conditions and soil moisture conditions and places stresses on the native species. Temperature patterns tell kind of a similar story. Average annual temperature has increased by almost 3.5 degrees over the last 100 years, but the details of how that temperature has shifted is just as important. So summer nighttime lows are not as low. Fall temperatures are staying warmer later into the year, extending the growing and tourist seasons and shifting our fall foliage patterns. Winters are getting warmer. Plant species adapted to and dependent upon those cold stresses of cold winters for regeneration are likely to do less well. Pests kept at bay by the cold may expand their range. More frequent freeze-thaw cycles may induce faster deterioration of our historic cultural resources. The visitation is also potentially impacted by climate change. Other areas of the country are warming to temperatures less suitable for visitation. Acadia is seeing its warming occur in the summer evenings and extended fall warmth. We may well see additional significant increases in visitation as a destination that sort of sits in that sweet spot for temperature. Increased visitation increases stresses to trails, to carriage roads, to visitor services, to the transportation system, and our ecological communities, and may increase the rate of spread of invasive and pest species. These changes in precipitation and temperature contribute to the likelihood of significant biome shifts. Spruce fir dominated forests may be replaced by forests dominated by hardwoods that are more commonly found to our south. Red spruce may decline significantly from heat and drought stresses, and other species with ranges just to the south may be better suited for our anticipated conditions. But that rate of change in conditions here is likely faster than natural species migration rates. And so managing for change is what we're interested in thinking about and doing now. So we often look back on past management or administrative decisions that contributed to these degraded conditions we have now, like installing undersized culverts, and think of them as mistakes that are harmful to the natural communities. And they are harmful, but it's a little unfair to refer to them as mistakes. You know, managers of the past did their best with what they had, the context that they lived in. Well, we're doing the same thing today. We're trying to do the best that we have with the information that's available in making our management decisions. But hopefully a key difference in our approach today is a growing understanding of the dynamic nature of ecological systems, particularly in relation to our changing climate. So managing for anticipated change is a little more challenging and requires assumptions about future conditions. It's not possible to know for certain the full details of those future conditions. So utilizing what we know in combination with a range of likely scenarios can help us determine approaches to manage for the future. And we're employing that idea that Nick was putting forward of resist, allow, and direct. You know, so NPS policies and budgetary constraints from the park have often focused us into a condition of typically identifying acute problems and finding an immediate fix to repair them, and repairing damaged infrastructure with in-kind replacements, and restoring natural communities to historic conditions. And we're proposing an approach to management that attempts to break with that practice of replacing in kind and the notion of restoring to past conditions, and thinking ahead to the future conditions and planning management strategies accordingly. So we've developed 3 priority projects to do the work under this idea of managing for change and thinking about our desired future conditions. So the park is removing an invasive species infestation in the Bass Harbor Marsh area. It's mostly glossy buckthorn, which Jesse spoke about just recently, but there are others. And we have funding from the Band Foundation to assist us, and it allows us to incorporate planting native species behind the invasives removal process. And that's in an attempt to suppress the reinfestation that likely would happen if the site were just left alone after the invasives removal. The second project that the park is working on is the Cadillac Summits, which you've also heard about today, and restoring or revegetating areas that have been damaged from trampling. And the same Band Foundation funding through Wild Acadia provides additional monitoring and evaluation to help that improve the transition from Cadillac to the other summits. And then the third project, which I'll speak about the most, is the work associated with a culvert replacement on the Park Loop Road. And within that project, Band funding is allowing us to look more broadly at the Great Meadow hydrology and build a more comprehensive project that addresses changed climate and our anticipated future conditions. So on the Great Meadow project, the park is replacing a culvert. It's on the loop road. This is at the outlet of Cromwell Brook, where it leaves the Great Meadow and then flows downstream into Keble Valley Club and through the town of Bar Harbor. The projects have been considered from the perspective of improving aquatic organism passage, but the park worked with the USGS to develop a study of the Great Meadow and the culvert to model the conditions, the current conditions, and conditions with the culvert replaced by an open bottom bridge designed for aquatic organism passage, which was sort of the main criteria at that time. What we're adding to this basic transportation project is a broader perspective on the hydrologic effects on the Great Meadow from both the culvert and from historic manipulations within the Great Meadow. And here's a shot of looking into the Great Meadow from that culvert. So you're standing basically on top of the culvert and looking into the Great Meadow and under semi-flooded conditions. So the history of the Great Meadow and of Cromwell Brook includes significant manipulation and human influence. There are two abandoned roadbeds that bisect the wetland. One of them you probably know as the popular trail, the Hemlock Road. The other is probably less well known on the east side of the Great Meadow. It was likely an extension of the road that predates the current Great Meadow Drive. And there are also legacy ditches that run through the Great Meadow that transmit water more quickly to the stream channel. And the stream channel has also been altered significantly, and it appears to be lowered from its historic channel profile. It was possibly done in coordination with construction of the loop road. And the result is a wetland with significantly reduced function as a wetland. And so the Great Meadow approach, you can see some of this historic, this is one of the old roads, I don't know which, another shot of an additional old road, abandoned roadbed now. Some of the legacy ditching that went on early in the Great Meadow. We want to move beyond that immediate transportation corridor in this project and look more broadly at the Great Meadow, upstream and downstream on culvert impacts. So what's happening because of that culvert upstream and downstream, but also do a coordinated and simultaneous projects to look at how we can improve the overall health of the Great Meadow, that entire wetland complex through a coordinated process. And so you move it towards more the desired future conditions that we've been wanting. So here's a shot of the Great Meadow. Looking down, you can see some of the blue lines, the ditches. You can also see I don't know if you see my mouse on there as well, hopefully you do, but you can see the old abandoned roadbed, some of the ditches that are there. And so what we're looking at doing is attempting to remedy some of those issues with the roadbed and the culverts and improve conditions in the Great Meadow simultaneously with this transportation corridor process to really alter that hydrology back to a system where the Great Meadow functions as a wetland and does flood mitigation as it should within that wetland versus having the culvert be the flood mitigation tool, essentially, that it has been, unfortunately. And so the new approach with this Wild Acadia Next really is similar to some of the other things that we've talked about today, where conditions are changing. We're trying to restore capacity instead of restoring back to a previous historical condition, and really thinking about change and upcoming changes and managing for that change into the future.
Thank you, Brian. And we have time for a question, if anybody has a question. Ann Gallagher, do you want to say your question that you put in the chat?
Hi, I can certainly say so. It's a very complicated question. So I didn't think you'd want to answer it this way, you know, in between presentations, but the gist is, how do you determine which native plants at what density and where they go in the planting scheme to do something that restores the conditions that you're trying to achieve while not being a replication of past conditions? Like, what do you all refer to as your reference touchstones to determine how you approach it?
So that's being done more so in the Bass Harbor Marsh work that we're doing, particularly with Jesse. And it kind of ties into the question that was asked earlier about Invasive's work in planting in, natives behind that. So what we've proposed to do for this year with the funding is to do kind of an experimental process. So the answer is we don't fully know which ones to plant behind and what type of density, but we're going to establish, with the help of great consultants, test plots and then monitoring of those test plots to try and better understand really what that answer might be. What types of plants do we want to have in there? What kind of density do we need? How does it interact with the ongoing invasives work? Because we haven't removed all the invasives, so there's additional work that needs to happen. So a lot of that is sort of in the works for us to try and understand through experimentation through this funding.
Good luck.
Thank you.
And now we're going to hear from Lydia Horne.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. I am hoping to tie in social science with the presentations that we've heard earlier in this session. So my name is Lydia. I am coming to you from Colorado today, where I'm a postdoc, but I want to talk about the research I was doing while at the University of Maine pursuing my PhD. So we're going to look a little bit about how visitors to Mount Desert Island and to Acadia National Park are intending to respond to some of the climate change impacts mentioned in the previous presentations. So some background information to get us started. We know that tourism is a globally important economic sector. A lot of tourism destinations are dependent on the natural resource base to provide key attractions and a desirable climate that attracts visitors. However, that dependence on the natural resource base means that tourism is vulnerable to climate change impacts. And the United Nations World Tourism Organization identified nature-based tourism destinations, coastal and mountain destinations as especially at risk to climate impacts. And some of the climate changes we're most concerned about for a coastal destination include things like sea level rise, flooding, extreme weather events, erosion, and saltwater intrusion, among others. And despite the tourism industry being relatively aware of climate change and the potential impacts, a recent study found that the industry as a whole is more vulnerable to climate change than resilient. But we also know that both visitors and tourism suppliers can take actions to increase a destination's resilience. So for this presentation, we're going to talk about adaptation, but there's also mitigation actions that can be taken. And we also know from previous research that climate change is going to impact tourism demand, as well as seasonality. So when visitors come to different destinations and the appeal that those destinations have. So as was mentioned in previous presentations, northern destinations are typically viewed as going to be more climatically appealing. And so visitation is expected to increase in those destinations that are occupying that climatic sweet spot. And this is what a recent study by our first presenter, Nick, found, where he was modeling expected increases in visitation to Acadia National Park because of those increasing average annual temperatures we're seeing under climate change. So I'm not going to get too far into the weeds, but I wanted to highlight a couple of the climate change impacts that the state of Maine is experiencing and will continue to experience. We've talked about increasing temperatures, the increase in precipitation overall, falling more in that fall season, and the decrease in snow. We're seeing a lengthening of the summer season and a shortening of the winter season. And that actually could be perceived as an opportunity for coastal Maine tourism destinations as that coincides with peak visitation. And then some of the other impacts we're keeping an eye on include the rapid warming of the Gulf of Maine, those more frequent, unpredictable extreme weather events, as well as a host of other changes, especially things like shifting species. We've talked about invasives in this session, as well as things like increased ticks and the increased risk of tick-borne illnesses that could impact visitors. And I like to note that, these may seem like they're all challenges to Maine's tourism industry, but it's important to remember that there are opportunities associated with some of those changes. And thinking back to Nick's framing of this session, you know, are we going to accept or resist some of these changes? And this is really getting at the idea of destination resilience through the matching of supply and demand. So we know that visitors will likely alter their travel behavior in some way as they respond to climate change. We also know that for a destination to be resilient, tourism suppliers have to anticipate those changes and respond to them. And this is really getting at the idea that supply and demand should be aligned, because a mismatch often results in destination decline, which is very opposite of destination resilience. And that kind of brings me to this overarching research goal for my time at the University of Maine, which was to understand how coastal nature-based tourism stakeholders, so both visitors and tourism suppliers, can adapt to negative climate impacts while also taking advantage of those emerging opportunities. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on those behavioral adaptations that visitors are intending to take. So to get at this question, we conducted a visitor survey in Acadia National Park a couple of years ago during the summer of 2018. So we were fortunate enough to receive permission to survey on site, and we did something called an intercept survey. So the right-hand picture is myself posing as a visitor with one of our undergraduate research assistants. And basically, the team, we were distributed across the park in locations such as, this is the Hulls Cove Visitor Center, but also at trailheads and other high flow visitation areas. And we would approach visitor groups, ask them to participate in a short front-end survey. And then, as you see in this picture, we would hand them a postcard that has a link to a longer follow-up survey. And that's really what we wanted them to do. So during the summer, we intercepted about 1,300 visitor groups and got 480 usable responses. So we're pretty happy about that. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to share one question and the descriptive results for that particular question, looking at visitor intention to substitute as a result of climate change. So in the follow-up survey, we asked visitors if climate conditions were no longer appropriate for their outdoor recreation pursuits on Mount Desert Island and in Acadia National Park, how likely would they be to engage in the following substitution behaviors? So in order by percentage, the most likely substitution behaviors were visiting another place in the US, visiting Acadia National Park and Mount Desert Island during another time of year, so engaging in temporal substitution, pursuing different tourism and outdoor recreation activities, so activity substitution. And then I want to highlight at the bottom, visiting another place in Maine, so spatial substitution within the state. And it should be noted that overall, the intention to substitute for all 6 of these options was relatively high, with even the last place option, visiting another place in Maine, having a 55% likely or very likely intention to engage in that substitution behavior. So to kind of wrap it up here, visitors are intending to continue to come to Acadia National Park and Mount Desert Island, which aligns with what previous research is telling us, but they are likely to engage in substitution behaviors while they're here, especially those temporal and activity substitution behaviors. So it's important for maintaining long-term destination resilience to anticipate these shifts in visitor behavior. So that can involve changing the timing of product offerings, diversifying and creating new product offerings. And of course, it will influence visitor management strategies as we see both the projected increase in visitation and then maybe those substitution behaviors as well. And something that is kind of interesting to consider in light of the increased visitation and perhaps resident or tourism supplier perceptions of crowding is that visitors are able to spatially adapt within a destination to avoid perceived negative conditions. So that might help, that in combination with that intention to temporally substitute might help spread out visitation over time and space and perhaps alleviate some of those undesired impacts from increased visitation. And in conclusion, I'll wrap up by saying that destination resilience is dependent on both visitors and suppliers adapting to changing climate conditions, as well as suppliers adapting to some of those social changes, like changes in visitation. And lastly, this is not a one-woman show. We have all of my collaborators and people who facilitated this work listed on the left, and all of the funding sources listed on the right. And that is all I have for you. I don't know if we have time for questions, Emma.
Yeah, does anyone have a question for Lydia? If not, you can think of some and we can come back in the group discussion afterwards, and you may have one then. So now we're going to go into breakout sessions. And so here are some questions that you can use if you need help getting your thoughts going to have some discussion. We're going to have the discussion for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back to a group discussion after that. So Roy, can you send everyone to their breakouts?
Are we in another? I feel like I don't know where I am.
Another breakout, or if it's the main.
That was a nice, well done, Jesse. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I wish we could get volunteers to do a lot of the work. I was just, anyway, yeah. I was talking with Diane about it today, about what's possible in 2021. Unfortunately, it'll be difficult to get people together to do the management work. Yeah.
Did anybody have, so I'm just gonna spend the next 10 minutes or so kind of in a big group discussion, helping to moderate a little bit. And I wonder if any of the groups had some burning discussions that they'd like to share with the large group, or if there are questions that maybe some of the other breakout hosts can address. Sarah.
I can go. And feel free, Anne, if you want to say this, but Anne made some really great comments and thinking about what we need to know, and also crosses over into what voices do we need to hear about, you know, we were talking a bit about connectivity and the importance of that. And she just made great points about the importance of linking with private landowners to kind of ensure connectivity. So I thought that was a key point.
I would only add that I had also thought that in the state of Maine and certainly around Acadia, the tribal communities would be very helpful.
Yeah, so Rebecca, I don't know, in our, the small group that I was in, we were talking a little bit about prioritization, and if you're going to figure out where to resist, accept, or direct, there's usually some sort of prioritizing exercise. And that if the right voices, such as Indigenous communities, are not in part of that exercise, then, you know, the idea of who's doing the prioritizing and for what values, that we might be missing some really important values. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to add to that. you're still here.
I think you said it very nicely. We'll hear a little more about this in the next session in March, when we have invited Dr. Bonnie Newsom, who's an anthropologist, archaeologist at the University of Maine, and Suzanne Greenlaw, who's been working on the sweetgrass harvesting in Bass Harbor Marsh project, to talk about Indigenous knowledge, and we can talk about how we're some of the conversations and the work we're doing around that. So, but yeah, that certainly goes without saying, that there are a lot of partners out there who have know a heck of a lot more than we do, and we need to listen to them.
Jesse, I wonder, can you address the earlier part of the question about landowners and how much, to what extent are you working with other conservation organizations and just private landowners?
Yeah,
our neighbors to the park.
We certainly try to engage with kind of the larger land managers, whether it's from nonprofits or kind of large land owners that neighbor the park, particularly on MDI. But it's an issue, right, within people that have backyards, or some of these pests that may originate. And we, in our small breakout group, we kind of were talking about this with the red pine scale, and I mentioned, we don't know where it came from, but it does come in with some Japanese black pine, for example, or some of these kind of landscape plants that might probably came from some gardens nearby. And so it's a challenge, but I think it's like one of the main things that we need to be doing. And if we're going to actually have some success in, if it's a resistance to particular species of taking over, then we need to engage those folks. And also somebody in the breakout group mentioned talking about, like, how do we prioritize what we're working on? There's certain assumptions like I am making about what's higher value, right? But somebody asked, what about invasive aquatic plants? So, like, I may not be working in the ponds and lakes as much, but that's absolutely something that we're concerned about as well. And so I didn't mention it in the presentation, but it's just sort of all these different systems too. And so we tend to come from different silos of, like, my system is the forest, or my system is whatever, the lakes or the rocks. And it's hard to kind of get the diverse perspective from everybody to figure out what's most important. So that includes neighbors, right? And, like, yeah, other landholders.
It also touches on the concept of what's important. How do you determine importance? And do you say this system is still functioning at such a high level that even though its contribution is small, its relative function is high, and therefore we will invest in that? Or do you say this system has not great functionality, but its contribution is huge, so we're investing in that? There's a lot of thought that needs to go into prioritization, I think. And I think your answer touched on that a little bit.
If I could just add a little bit to Catherine, the way in which we started with the Wild Acadia Initiative, and we're continuing to do it, is to really have sort of a diverse group of people, including a lot of the different disciplines and divisions within the park, plus outside park folks, right? That's sort of one of the real benefits, I think, with having me, sort of outside from Friends of Acadia and working directly as a partner within the park service, is that I get to work more broadly with a larger group of people kind of on a day-to-day basis and bring them all together. And we've done a couple of field trips recently with a bunch of people that are all stakeholders and have interests in, a couple of the projects that we've got going on. And we've included communications folks as well. And so you get everybody into the same space and you get to look at what's going on and really spend time understanding what are the issues and understanding other people's perspectives on what can and can't be done, or what is easy to do and not as easy to do. And I think it does help kind of coordinate your approach a fair amount. And then the other aspect of it that I'll maybe promote a little bit is in that, doing some strategic planning. So, like, we use the open standards to create a resource management plan, which some folks are familiar with. And that helps with that prioritization as well. Thinking about what Anne was talking about, where you've got, maybe a large area that's not in great condition, but does provide, because it is so large, a lot that you may want to preserve, even if it isn't in great condition, and other areas where, you know, maybe they're not providing as much. I think I'm maybe paraphrasing what Anne was talking about enough, but those planning processes can help you in that prioritization as well, with lots of folks from lots of different.
This ties in with something that my breakout room had talked about, which is the role of engaging communities or visitors to the park in things like citizen or community science as a way to gather data and communicate the things that are happening in the park, as well as increasing like the capacity for data gathering. And luckily, Seth Benz was in my group and was able to speak more about the community science projects happening in the park. But if anyone else wants to speak to that, feel free to add to that conversation.
I will just add a comment from our group that that we are, you know, just stay tuned, because I think there's going to be some exciting community science happening with Acadia this summer. That's going to involve revisiting some historic data sets. So just everyone on this list, I think, will be informed about that. Abe, you had a comment or a question?
I guess I was just going to say, I do agree, kind of in line with what Lydia was saying too, that it's important to engage the communities in these discussions, both the indigenous communities, but also the other local communities. And I think we still have a ways to go to do better with that. But I also had a separate question, kind of changing topics a little bit for Lydia. Are there examples of climate change already changing visitor behavior in other locations or in Maine specifically? And I apologize if you mentioned this and I just missed it in the talk, but yeah, could you speak to that maybe?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not sure that there's anything that's looking at past behavior specific to the state of Maine and changes that are already happening. That's actually been something that the lab I was part of has been trying to do, but it's hard to, on an academic calendar, it's hard to do things like sample in the fall, for example. But there are examples from other places, especially in Europe, where visitation is already changing, especially, well, I will say Europe, and then a lot of winter studies in the Northeast as well, where visitation is already changing, and it's related to a lot of factors. One thing that we talked about in the breakout room was how visitor behavior might change relative to what types of activities people want to engage in. So if somebody is coming, for example, to Acadia National Park to engage in one activity that they're very committed to, and conditions are maybe not as desirable, they're perhaps likely to respond differently than someone who's coming to engage in a lot of different activities. They're hiking, they're bird watching, you know, they're driving around for the scenery. So there are multiple motivations for that visitor to still come to the area. Whereas if somebody is only engaging in one activity, they might be more likely to either switch to a different activity or go to a different place, perhaps, you know, going north or something like that.
I wonder, Stephanie Spera, do you want to mention anything about changing seasonality of visitation?
Yeah, so for sure. So I'm looking at one of my research projects in Acadia is looking at how fall foliage, how climate change is affecting the timing of fall foliage and how it's affecting visitation. Sarah told me my signs are all over the park. You can't not see them in the fall. But we're doing a few things. But one of the things we are seeing, right, Acadia is getting hotter, it's getting wetter. I had a student who did a historical analysis looking for peak fall foliage, and we have just newspapers, old MPS reports, all that stuff. And essentially, it's the timing of peak fall foliage has been delayed a decade. So in the 40s and 50s, peak fall foliage would occur October 4th and 5th. And as we all know, now it's around Indigenous Peoples Day weekend, right? And so I'm working on some of the stuff to disentangle the climate signal, but also Lydia, I'll probably reach out to you because we've been doing, had one season of surveys asking visitors questions in the park saying, when do you plan your trip? Is this super planned ahead of time, or are you making the decision now? It's a little bit dependent on where they're coming from, right? But we see September and October, I've seen the greatest increases in visitation in Acadia. So I think you can expect that to shift, right? So we're trying to back that out a little bit. We couldn't do surveys this, obviously, 2020, what a year it's been, right? But I'm gonna harass Sarah Hall until she gets me COA students for next fall to do these surveys. But yeah, so we do see, I mean, they're related, right? And the citizen science part's really interesting and hard to pull back, but we do see visitation increasing and we see fall foliage. We see the timing of fall shifting. So
we see that in Cape Cod in a very obvious way too. The shoulder seasons, you know, it used to be, you know, deserted here after Labor Day. Now people are well into the fall, even winter, and very early in the spring. And another interesting interaction, you know, among climate change and people's preferred activities and shifts in those is that, you know, a number of factors, including seal population rebounding, but also our warming waters that facilitate a lot of great white, you know, huge population of great whites. And we have noticed, don't have any hard data on this because it's hard to figure out how to monitor it, but people with families and kids, small kids, shifting their water-based activities to our kettle ponds. And we've noticed, and we have tons of shoreline trampling and stuff that we already have to remediate. And we think that that's just going to increase. And also sea level rise is pushing our water level, pushing the fresh groundwater lands up such that, you know, outside the annual variability, our ponds are, you know, getting higher and higher and leaving less kind of beach or suitable shoreline for people to recreate on, and you know, and so they keep trampling back up into the, now they're hitting trees, you know, and now there's like parts of the understory that it's just bare sand and a bunch of pine trees growing up. And anyway, so that's kind of an interesting climate, you know, wildlife based, you know, people interaction activity dynamic that we're seeing there.
Yeah, if we've learned anything from the last year, I think it's that the parks are not enough. We need a lot more space and nearby nature for people to experience, and enough for everybody to have an enjoyable and restoring experience. Any sort of final last questions? There's a comment, Tegwin shared a reference in the chat about visitor behavior regarding ocean conservation. I don't know if you, Tegwin, if you want to just say a few words about that paper that you just shared.
Sure. Yeah, I actually, I don't know very much about it. I just want my advisor here at UMaine, Carly Spinarski, that was her postdoc, or part of her postdoc. But they were assessing like whale watcher, like so tourists essentially coming to the area, some were local, for whale watching, and gauge, I think, their motivations and then like their long-term goals. Like if you knew that this hurt whales, could you change your behavior? I think was the point of the whole project.
And I also want to thank you on the visitor. So session 6 that we don't have a date yet. Adam Gibson from Acadia National Park and Laura Cohen will join us, and we're hoping to have more discussion about sort of human dimensions of Acadia. So this conversation, I think, is to be continued. And thanks everybody. I'm going to turn it back over to Emma for some wrap up.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining us. I'm going to share my screen, and I have a slide with the date for the next symposium session that Rebecca had already mentioned. And so it's going to be March 19th, which is a Friday at noon, and it's on Wabanaki knowledge, perspectives, and science in Acadia. And the details and registration will probably be coming out next week. I will be sending up a follow-up email to all of you probably next week with the link to the recording for this session, the registration for the next session, if that's available yet, attendee list, and then if you have any feedback, you can always reply to that email with any feedback you have for us. And I think that is it. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you at the next session.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a bunch, Emma and Catherine, especially for doing the organizing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Good job, everyone. Thank you. Very informative.